Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States is the most coveted job in the whole world. Many people would do almost anything to become the leader of the free world, but all those people would fail because this job is so coveted by people that worship power over others so much that they are willing to do anything to rise to that coveted position. Lately, however, the gaping lack of just basic leadership ability has led to some absolutely disgusting examples of questionable behavior by our elected officials. Corruption and incompetence cannot alone explain this type of behavior. Look at the complete insanity of our culture. How did these clowns seize control over everything?
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
There has been a cultural race to the bottom over the course of my lifetime, and I'm sure you can see it in your life. It's ubiquitous. But how did this happen? Depravity on this scale by the leadership of the free world doesn't just happen overnight. The corruption allowed to fester in our society because of the lack of leadership is about to bury freedom-loving people all over the world, and our people are too sick to see it. As God says, thy whole head is sick, thy whole heart is sick.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes.
How did this come about, you ask? Sit back and relax as I take you on a tour through the sewer under 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, through Brooks Brown Harriman, represented banking and industrial interests on both sides of the Atlantic before, during, and after the atrocities of World War II. While all of their clients profited from the traitorous work of the Dulles brothers in World War II, one family made sure they gained more than all of the others combined: the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers had long before learned how to hide their wealth in foundations and their power through the use of cutouts. People hired simply to represent the interests of the Rockefellers in their pursuit of power. It was obvious to the Rockefellers that as they collected economic power over a country's economy, that would attract unwanted political interference. So they learned to use cutouts, hundreds of men positioned strategically all around the world to protect their interests. People like their political bagman, John Foster Dulles, traveling the world with suitcases full of cash, bribes to corrupt officials in order to smooth the path for the Rockefeller family to do anything they wanted. Or his Ivy League hitman brother Allen Dulles, who simply removed human obstacles by removing their human lives. However, while the Dulles brothers seemed to bask in success after success financially during the period between the world wars, not all was as it seemed to the Dulleses, or to the Rockefellers and their numerous cutouts. Because while the Rockefellers were reaping the financial rewards of having their traitorous minions working on both sides of the World War II war zones, they were being watched by both Churchill and Roosevelt. While Churchill would never have turned on his privileged banker friends in MI5 and MI6, FDR was another story. FDR had spent years fighting the Rockefellers politically. Roosevelt simply couldn't wait for the destruction and the surrender of Germany. All throughout the political odyssey that was Roosevelt's New Deal, he knew where the opposition had its sharpest focus. From 1939 onwards, Roosevelt allowed this man, a Canadian named William Stevenson, to ply his trade in the United States. Stevenson reported daily to both Churchill and Roosevelt transcripts of every correspondence the Rockefellers had with their cutouts and their Nazi partners. He had transcripts of their business conferences and telephone conversations. He even had phonograph records of the war profiteering in the Rockefellers' own voices, father and sons, giving commands to their cutouts. Before he was done, Stevenson had bugged a large part of New York's financial district, several floors of the Rockefeller Center, two of the Rockefellers' private clubs, the RCA building, and several shipping companies. The bugs were very crude by today's standards. They were small microphones hardwired to hundreds of machines that cut phonograph records or cylinders. It was a huge operation, right in the center of New York, taking an entire floor of 30 Rockefeller Center. And Stevenson managed to keep it a complete secret. Ostensibly, Stevenson's job was to identify companies that were aiding the Nazis and pass that information along to Hoover's FBI. However, often Hoover would refuse to take action against the traitors, especially if they were connected, so MI6 agents would be forced to murder the offending party. Hoover would complain often to Roosevelt about Stevenson, but the FBI could never discover any proof that Stevenson was behind any of the suspicious accidents. In the spring of 1941, Bill Donovan, who hated Allen Dulles passionately, invited Allen Dulles to head up the New York branch of the Coordinator of Information, Roosevelt's precursor to the OSS and the CIA. Its primary mission was to trap Nazi collaborators. In effect, Roosevelt was asking Dulles to inform on his very own clients. Not surprisingly, for a man of bottomless deceit, Allen Dulles accepted and moved into the COI's new offices on the 25th floor of the Rockefeller Center. Meanwhile, one floor below on the 24th were the offices of Britain's purchasing agent, Bill Stevenson. Roosevelt even had a spy inside Dulles' own offices, Arthur Goldberg, a man who would eventually become Supreme Court Justice of the United States. Every single day, Roosevelt would smile as he read and listened to Rockefeller and his cutouts betray their own country. The problem with the setup was that the wiretaps were illegal and inadmissible in court. What Roosevelt needed was witnesses and corroborating proof. But if polio had taught Roosevelt anything, it had taught him to be patient. Eventually, Dulles requested a transfer to Bern, Switzerland, the only place from which he could continue to manage his clients' massive interests in Nazi Germany. As a smokescreen, Donovan offered him the more prestigious London job, but, his blue eyes twinkling as he basked in a moment of feigned humility, Dulles insisted on doing his part in Switzerland. This time the little mouse was Allen Dulles, edging closer and closer to the cheese, and Stevenson and Donovan and Roosevelt were the ones waiting in the dark. Roosevelt knew the full scope of Rockefeller's and all the other traitorous clients of Sullivan Cromwell's plan, almost from the very beginning. Their agents in Germany were either to aid Hitler and forge a peace treaty with the West, or to assassinate Hitler and forge a peace treaty with the West, painting communist Russia as the real enemy to freedom, all the while favoring U.S. and British-owned assets in Germany. In addition to protecting and growing Western assets in Germany during World War II, Dulles' job was to negotiate the basis of World War III with the Abwehr's Wilhelm Canaris. It was to be a kinder, gentler Germany, along with the Western democracies together, all against the hated evil Russian communists. What did it matter that millions and millions of Russian peasants would die? There was billions and trillions of dollars to be made, and whoever made them would take over the world. Also unknown to Dulles, Army intelligence had bugged the dedicated landline between German and Swiss intelligence. All communications between Switzerland and Germany were being intercepted by the U.S. Army. In addition to this, Dulles was also being spied upon by agents of the Luftwaffe. All of this evidence from all sides was to be poured into Operation Safe Haven, FDR's trap to destroy the Rockefellers' deviance once and for all. As the war progressed, the trap, now administered by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau and FBR, grew in size and scope. By Sicily in 1943, it was already massive in size, incriminating hundreds of lawyers and bankers and businessmen. Their plan was to wait until Schacht and Abs and Thyssen and Krupp and all the other Nazis who had hidden huge assets in Switzerland with the help of Dulles and his cronies, including the Vatican, were in the dock at Nuremberg. Then all the wiretap evidence could be unleashed, convicting them, and more importantly, their Nazi counterparts in the West. At the Nuremberg war trials, Not only Allen and John Foster Dulles would be at the end of a rope, so would Henry Ford, Edwin Pauley, James Forrestal, and a host of other Rockefeller cutouts, including Nelson Rockefeller and J.D. himself. The immense scale of the amount of Western aid to Nazi Germany would have been uncovered. The Standard Oil blackmail against the United States would be avenged, and many of the Rockefeller banking and industrial cutouts would be exposed and ruined, with more than a few of them hanging at the end of a rope. Unfortunately, it all went for naught because of this man, FDR's Vice President, Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was an Iowa corn farmer and small-town newspaper editor and one of the most popular politicians in the country in the 1930s and 40s. As a boy, he had developed a love for plants from his mother and from George Washington Carver, whom his parents had taken in when racial prejudice prevented Carver from staying in the university dorms. Wallace was a great man, and his dream was to free the entire world from hunger. His hybrid corn seed helped American farmers rebound from the Depression and would eventually make him a very wealthy man. But in 1943, he was FDR's vice president and the second most popular man in America after FDR. Wallace was a totally honest man, plain speaking and down to earth. He loved his wife Elo very much and enjoyed many stimulating conversations with his brother-in-law, the Swiss ambassador to the U.S., Karl Bruggemann. Unfortunately for Mr. Wallace, it was during one of these stimulating after-dinner conversations that Mr. Wallace let slip FDR's plans to allow the Eastern money elite just enough rope to hang themselves, and that all of their traitorous deeds were being watched, and that their day of reckoning would soon come. Unfortunately, this information was relayed back to Switzerland in the ambassador's routine dispatches home. The dispatch was read by the head of the Swiss Secret Service, who was also a double agent in the employ of Nazi Germany. When the Nazis learned of FDR's plans, they immediately got word back to Allen Dulles. Dulles began to use the Anglicans and the Vatican to move the tainted money and Nazi war criminals out of Germany. The Vatican, along with the Red Cross, were to provide fake identification papers. It must have been a humbling moment indeed when Allen Dulles had to tell his brother that FDR knew everything about their misdeeds and that something had to be done. It fell to John Foster Dulles to go to J.D. Rockefeller himself and fall on his sword. He told the old man that they had one last hope, FDR's mortality. Rockefeller was forced to use his top cutout in the Democratic Party, Edwin Pauley, to rig the 1944 presidential election, not for the president, because FDR could have won that election without even getting out of bed. Even Rockefeller couldn't rig that. But for the vice president, Rockefeller knew that if Wallace were to become president after the passing of FDR, they would all be counting the days till they were swinging from the hangman's rope. Their only hope was the Democratic Convention. Rockefeller put the screws to the heads of the Democratic Party to fall in line. Although the Democratic Party heavily favored Harry Truman, Wallace led after the first round of votes, 429 to 319. When he heard the news, Rockefeller called Pauley and told him absolutely under no circumstance was Wallace to gain the vice presidential nomination or else. And Pauley knew exactly what that meant. In the midst of a cacophony of delegates screaming for Wallace's nomination to vice president, Convention Chair Samuel Jackson raced to the microphone and proposed that the vote be postponed until the next day. Although an overwhelming majority yelled no at the top of their lungs, Jackson pounded the gavel on the dais and proclaimed the voting over for the day. Democratic bosses Frank Walker, Bob Hannigan, Edwin Pauley, Ed Flynn, Chicago Mayor Joseph Kelly, and George E. Allen spent the entire night and well past lunch the next day promising anything and everything to each and every Democratic Party delegate. Greed triumphed, and Truman won the next ballot, 1,031 to 105. Adding insult to injury, Democratic National Committee Chairman Bob Hannigan told the Chicago Tribune that he wanted his tombstone inscribed with the words, "Here lies the man who stopped Henry Wallace from becoming President of the United States." But Hannigan and his cohorts had done much more than that. In reality, Pauley and Hannigan had killed FDR's dream of overcoming the evil that had taken over in America. On his way back from Japan, FDR was a man lost in a storm, unsure as to how to proceed, and quickly losing the will to fight.
And in the midst of that, Senator Claude Pepper from Florida realizes if he could get Wallace's name and nomination that night, then he'll defy the party bosses. Wallace will sweep the nomination, he'll get back on the ticket as vice president, and Pepper fights his way up to the microphone.
Not knowing what to do, Jackson called the vote for adjournment. A few said aye, but the overwhelming majority boomed nay. And yet, Jackson had the gall to announce that the vote to adjourn had passed. It was outrageous. Confusion filled the hall. Pepper had reached the first step of the stage, only 5 feet, probably 9 seconds from the microphone, before the bosses forced adjournment against the will of the delegates. If he could have nominated Wallace in those moments, there is no doubt Henry Wallace would have been overwhelmingly returned as vice president. What I understood Pepper wrote was that for better or worse, history was turned topsy-turvy that night in Chicago. Samuel Jackson apologized to Pepper the next day, and Pepper wrote in his autobiography that Jackson said, "I had strict instructions from Hannigan not to let the convention nominate the vice president last night."
Before his death, FDR told nothing to Truman about the development of the atomic bomb or Operation Safe Haven. Only Morgenthau and Wallace knew of FDR's plan to trap the Wall Street pirates. Now FDR was gone and Wallace emasculated. It was left to Morgenthau alone to defend FDR's secret plan. But Truman did not like Morgenthau. When information about the Nazi final solution became undeniable, Morgenthau used every opportunity to pressure Truman into doing more to free captured Jews, something the British and every other American advisor counseled him against. In the end, Morgenthau realized the hopelessness of his position and resigned. Truman was grateful to the Democratic Party bosses that had secured the VP's nomination for him, making sure most of his appointments were also Rockefeller cutouts. Defense Secretary James Forrestal ensured that all of Rockefeller's traitorous business deals were deleted from Operation Safe Haven. Then, Rockefeller showed his true mafia style. When Forrestal had a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized, Rockefeller and Dulles, afraid that Forrestal still had copies of the undoctored Safe Haven report, had Forrestal murdered in a way that suggested suicide. As always with Dulles' frequent episodes as a hitman to the oligarchy, no loose ends could be left behind. Truman was also never told about Nelson Rockefeller's traitorous adventures in South America. Nelson Rockefeller used World War II to gain control over South America's natural resources, ostensibly to keep them out of the hands of the British. But Rockefeller saw to it that the Germans were given a free pass in South America. At every opportunity, Rockefeller blocked British investment and threatened to stop the shipment of much-needed supplies. Standard Oil, General Electric, and United Fruit began to take over each country one by one. Rockefeller's short game was to use World War II to take control over each and every one of South America's countries' economies. His long game was to use those countries' voting rights in the United Nations to further his family's aim to control the world. At Yalta in 1945, Harry Truman promised Stalin that Argentina would never be allowed entry into the United Nations as punishment for their acceptance of so many Nazi war criminals. However, using the power of his voting bloc, Rockefeller pushed it through the UN anyways. Exasperated and incensed, Harry Truman ordered Rockefeller to the White House and fired him. Nelson Rockefeller was flabbergasted, but he had learned a valuable lesson about respecting executive power. Rockefeller became a pariah in Washington returning to New York in shame. From now on, he would never allow any leader, even an American president, to ever stand in his way again. In 1948, Rockefeller financed Dewey's presidential campaign, but even Rockefeller money couldn't buy him the presidency this time. The New York mob, for years incensed by Dewey's heavy-handed treatment of them, ignored Rockefeller's influence and threw the 1948 presidential election onto the doorstep of a sleeping Harry Truman. When Eisenhower ran for president, he only did so because he realized there was no one else qualified to lead the country. Eisenhower did not want to be president, but he also did not want to see America's victory in World War II become marginalized by the growth of communism. In 1952, he took stock of America's position in the world and the condition of America herself, and decided to run for office. When he won and became the 34th President of the United States, he became the second president to take office ignorant of the extent the Rockefeller family and their cutouts had betrayed the country in World War II. For the first 6 years of his presidency, Eisenhower did his best to safeguard the nation and the world. When his second term entered the home stretch, his thoughts began to consider his legacy. He had never actually wanted to be president. He only entered politics to ensure the peace he had helped to win in 1945 would be of some benefit, not just to America, but to the entire world. In December 1959, as his presidency was drawing to a close, Eisenhower, a man whose health had been failing him for some time, undertook an exhausting 11-nation tour designed to shore out international support for a planned summit meeting in Paris to sign a treaty of détente and nuclear disarmament scheduled for the following May. To say the tour was an unabashed success would be an understatement. Eisenhower was known around the world as the supreme commander who had won the World War and now was battling to win the world peace. Massive crowds cheered him everywhere he went. Over 1 million people came out to hear him speak in New Delhi. It was impossible not to be impressed. Certainly from their offices in New York and Washington, the Rockefellers and their cutouts were taking notice. Their plans for World War III and the destruction and exploitation of the riches of the Soviet Union had been thwarted in 1945. It had taken their best men and more than a little luck to keep those plans from being discovered. Now, 15 years later, with a peace plan being put forward to the world by America's greatest soldier, something had to be done to thwart the plan. But the question was, what could be done? This problem, like so many before, landed on the desk of Allen Dulles in the spring of 1959. Dulles had never failed his overlords before. From the time he became CIA director in 1953, Dulles had been expanding the role of the CIA into every aspect of domestic and military affairs. Of course, there was a perfectly valid reason for this. If the CIA needed 100 planes and 100 pilots on a moment's notice, they had to have them. They had to have representative experts working for the CIA in every branch of the military and in all key industries. Even though they may report for work each day at the Pentagon in Washington, Boeing in Seattle, Kodak in Schenectady, or the Times newspaper in New York, they worked for and were paid for by Dulles and the CIA. These were loyal Americans doing a job they were proud of. They were doing their bit to make a dangerous world a safer place. So when Francis Gary Powers climbed into his U-2 reconnaissance aircraft and taxied onto the runway, he had no idea he was flying into history. He only knew he had orders to taxi onto the runway at Peshawar, Pakistan. As usual, one of a trio of U-2s ordered to prepare for each mission. Powers had no idea that his Hicon 73B spy camera had been removed and replaced by an old World War II reconnaissance camera during its last repair and overhaul stint at Lockheed. He didn't know that the canister of pure hydrogen and oxygen that kept his aircraft turning at the razor-thin atmosphere he flew at was only half full. And he most certainly didn't know that all of his personal effects, his driver's license, photographs, wristwatch, even his military ID, had been stolen from his locker and stashed in a compartment under his ejection seat. When Powers U-2 literally ran out of fuel midway through his journey across the Soviet Union, he was hoping against hope he could simply coast to a lower altitude, fire his engine again, and speed away. But when the Soviets shot down one of their own MiGs after he descended to around 30,000 feet, Powers decided to glide down as quickly as possible. After his capture, when his Russian interrogators called him by his first name and began relating to him personal details of his life, Powers was confused, confounded, and genuinely impressed by the abilities of the Soviet Secret Service to find out so much about him so quickly. No one in the world, least of all the most qualified of all the U-2 pilots, Francis Gary Powers, realized that he had become a pawn in the Rockefeller struggle to take over the world. That is, no one with the exception of one man, Dwight D. Eisenhower. When a seriously ill President Eisenhower learned that Vice President Richard Nixon had authorized the flight as a result of a direct plea from DCI Allen Dulles, Eisenhower knew that his hopes for a peaceful legacy had been intentionally scuttled. Soon after this incident, Eisenhower would say goodbye with his famous industrial military complex speech. But it wasn't supposed to be this way for Richard Nixon, where nothing seemed to go right for him. In 1952, Nixon had to give his famous Checkers speech, begging Eisenhower not to toss him from the ticket. Eisenhower became incensed listening to the speech when he heard Nixon insist that all candidates, including Eisenhower, reveal their personal finances. After World War II, Allen Dulles had given Lieutenant Nixon a cover story about earning money through playing poker during his tour of duty. Enough money to finance his first campaign as a congressman from California. In actuality, he had received his campaign financing from J.D. Rockefeller in recompense for his ignoring the Nazi war record of Karl Blessing. Blessing was the head of the Nazi oil cartel in partnership with Dulles' client, I.G. Farben, and one of Rockefeller's key allies in his plan to use Germany to invade Russia. Nixon passed Blessing's record on to Allen Dulles, who promptly destroyed it. In his early political life, Richard Nixon quickly became Allen Dulles' best mouthpiece in Congress and Rockefeller's top cutout. However, he had always taken a back seat to Eisenhower from the very beginning, when the stress of the 1952 campaign nearly broke him, through the middle years when Eisenhower cruelly ignored him, to the final couple of years when Nixon actually ran the Eisenhower White House during the long periods when Ike was too ill to function as a president. It must have been a strange moment for Eisenhower's second-in-command when Nixon was ordered to sabotage Ike's quest for peace by ordering Powers' sabotaged U-2 flight. Eisenhower had never fully trusted Nixon, but to allow Nixon to knife him in the back and ruin what would have been Eisenhower's crowning legacy and a huge step towards a safer world, it was galling beyond belief. Eisenhower had spent so much of his life as a soldier, facing down enemies and convincing little tin-pot politicians to join him in his quest for peace. He had been too busy, too focused on challenges coming straight at him from the outside, to remain on guard to an attack from inside his own command, from a man he disrespected and considered a quisling, a man who had used the tools of deceit and subterfuge to cut him down, just as he was about to realize his lifelong dream of world peace. It was galling beyond belief, but Ike had to accept his turn in the spotlight was over, and he quickly came to realize what was really important in life.
We were working on the farm, and my sister Susan was saddling up a horse by the barn, and the horse broke loose and headed for the putting green down below the sun porch. And darn it, that horse didn't just chew that putting green up, which they just restored for, you know, at the cost of thousands of dollars. And everybody's sitting around, and I'm sure that going through everybody's mind is, what is the general going to say? And he watched this horse gallivanting around on the putting green, and he leaned back and he says, "Isn't that the most beautiful sight you've ever seen?"
The presidency of JFK was to be seminal in its nature. Unknown to the electorate at that time, John Kennedy intended to lead the United States in a 180-degree turn away from confrontation with the Soviet Union. 1960s America had been stung by the shock of Sputnik, a tiny electronic beeper the Russians had hoisted into low orbit. In his first term, he challenged only his own nation to be the first to land a man on the moon. However, in his second term, Kennedy fully intended to cooperate with the Soviet Union in landing a man on the moon. It would not be a race between capitalism and communism. It would be a Herculean effort by all of mankind working together to achieve a great benefit for all of mankind. He also fully supported his brother in his attacks against the forces of corruption in America and the world. The track of his presidency would have been twofold in scope. One, to scour away the blight of poverty, crime, corruption, and decay. The other, to inspire to lead America and the world away from fear and war. Kennedy would inherit Dulles' designed-to-fail plan to invade Cuba with 1,500 disaffected Cuban freedom fighters through a mosquito-infested swamp against Castro's army of over 200,000 men. After being kneecapped by Nixon and the Pentagon, Eisenhower was too sick and too tired to stand in Dulles' way. Now it was Kennedy's turn. Kennedy agreed to the plan, but only without any overt American military assistance. Dulles sprang his trap, confident Kennedy would cave and send in the Marines. To the Pentagon's shock and horror, the president stood his ground and refused. After the failure of the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy met separately with Nixon and Eisenhower. After being scolded by Eisenhower about his failure to sound out the Pentagon properly about the folly behind pursuing such a venture, Kennedy was told to speak with Nelson Rockefeller. One can only imagine the tone of that conversation. Rockefeller had owned Cuba until it was stolen by Castro. Rockefeller knew that after the Bay of Pigs disaster, the politics of Cuba was Kennedy's Achilles heel. Kennedy knew Rockefeller was his only real opposition to re-election in 1964 and his father's arch enemy. It is almost certain that Rockefeller told Kennedy to bomb Cuba into dust. When JFK hung up that phone, he was committed not only to settling the Cuban issue without the use of force, but to making permanent peace with the Soviets. Well, that part of the Kennedy legacy was to be that the office of the president would now control the government, including the Pentagon, State Department, and CIA, and that the people would democratically choose the president. He knew that this was the opposite of what the Rockefellers thought of the American presidency, as just another cutout who did what he was told. When Kennedy, who was being watched constantly by a host of different agencies, made that fateful decision to seek permanent peace and cooperation with the USSR, those agents reported back to their bosses Kennedy's intention to go his own way, and plans were set in motion to derail the president permanently with utmost prejudice. Nelson Rockefeller spent the first 18 months of Kennedy's presidency trying his best to protect and strengthen his Latin and South American power base, all the while trying to sell everyone he met on the merits of personal nuclear fallout shelters. Kennedy was moving on with his own plans to move control of the dollar away from central banks and back to the U.S. Treasury, to bring the Pentagon to heel, to remove all personnel from Southeast Asia, to de-escalate Cuba and effect not just rapprochement, but real cooperation with the Soviets on a flight of discovery to the moon. Needless to say, this was dangerous insanity to the CIA and the JCS, especially Air Force General Curtis LeMay, a man with only a very tenuous grip on his gigantic ego. By the spring of 1963, the hatred and contempt for Kennedy inside the officers of the JCS and the Pentagon had grown exponentially, many of them considering their president a traitor to America. We now know that as he began his re-election tour in 1963, Kennedy was being stalked by his assassins. Stops in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Miami were tentatively being considered by the men of the traitorous cabal drawn together from all the services, with just one aim: to end the life of the U.S. president. Finally, in Dallas, they struck. Thanks to the Assassination Records Review Board, we know now that President Kennedy was shot 5 times from at least 3 separate sniper positions, once in the back and once in the throat, cutting off his ability to breathe, then 3 times in the head, all 3 bullets arriving at the same instant, most assuredly at the point of a command barked through headsets to the assassins by a central command unit, probably set up in one of the buildings around Dealey Plaza. His complete removal from power was absolutely necessary. The traitors knew that should Kennedy be allowed to escape Dealey Plaza alive, even in a vegetative state, Robert Kennedy would have them all identified within a year. Thanks to the ARRB, we now also know that the Zapruder film was doctored, removing the gigantic splash of the last 3 bullets arriving at the same time, then distributed to all the different U.S. intelligence agencies within 48 hours of the Kennedy assassination. The tape was then buried for 15 years from public view by Henry Luce, the owner of Time and Life. We also now know that Kennedy's corpse was brutally disfigured by Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell, Navy pathologists, in a pathetically amateurish attempt to clandestinely destroy evidence before the sham of the official autopsy began. One can only speculate about the ultimate disposition of JFK's testicle, considering the unprecedented depravity of the entire sorry affair. We now also know that the Soviets had 98 thermonuclear weapons installed and operative prior to the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was completely unknown to the braggarts of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or, if they knew, they lied to the President. We do know that they continually goaded Kennedy to attack Cuba immediately before the nuclear weapons became operational. We also know now that if Kennedy had acquiesced to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and provided U.S. air cover to the Bay of Pigs attack, Russian battlefield commanders had the authority to nuke Task Force Alpha, which included 2 aircraft carriers, the Essex and the Independence, a light cruiser, the USS Galveston, a full Marine landing brigade, and 2 full squadrons of destroyers. If Kennedy had ordered the Navy to provide air cover to the Cuban freedom fighters as the JCS had repeatedly demanded of him, the Russian field commanders had the authority and would have used their battlefield nuclear weapons to defend the island, and World War III would have begun. The point man in the JFK assassination was the shark, Allen Dulles. It was a plot bought and paid for by the wealthiest men in America, carried out by sections of Army and Naval Intelligence, supported by the FBI and the upper echelon of the CIA, including but not limited to their representatives in the mafia and the mass media. Their target was their boss, President John Kennedy, who threatened to weaken all of their power, the power that they worshipped and lusted. Oswald was set up to be their patsy. Their plan was still the original plan, 30 years later, just as it had always been, working towards the destruction of the Soviet republics and the ownership and exploitation of the natural resources of those countries by the richest men of the United States, the Crowns, the Rockefellers, and all of their cutouts. The plan to trap these evil men was lost when FDR's body and spirit, exhausted by decades of public service in peace and in war, finally gave out on him on April 12, 1945. He had shepherded the nation through the blackest years of the Depression, the shock of Pearl Harbor, and the difficult war years. On the cusp of victory, God allowed the light to go out on the life of FDR. Along with that light went his secret plan to prosecute the bankers and industrialists who had bankrolled, planned, and executed their plan to use the German government and her people to destroy the communist republics and to take all of their wealth for themselves. With the death of FDR, the Rockefellers were able to use their cutouts to hide evidence of their malevolence. When Kennedy threatened to derail their plans of world domination, they destroyed him as crudely and as brutally as possible in order to send a message to anyone who might be foolish enough to follow in his footsteps ever again. What the Kennedy brothers didn't understand in the 1960s, and what most people still don't understand today, is how the upper echelons of wealthy industrialists, bankers, organized crime, military chiefs, and political power brokers are all connected by their all-consuming lust for power. In the 60s, it was the Rockefeller family who called the shot, seen and heard around the world. Incensed at the Danite stubbornness of the Kennedys, terrified of losing their grip on world events, and running out of time in their power play to take over the world. Power-hungry people like the Rockefeller family and their cutouts murdered the President of the United States of America, creating a vacuum at the epicenter of world power, which would be exploited by the most vile and scrupulous, self-seeking adventurers in the years that followed. Like the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the murder of President Kennedy was seminal in nature. After the death of Lincoln, the United States, the nation God lovingly calls Manasseh, rose to greater and greater heights until she became the single most powerful nation in the history of mankind. After the death of John F. Kennedy, Manasseh was left rudderless, permanently trapped in a 1,000-mile stare, tossed about by the intrigues of smaller nations. Cowed by the brutality of Kennedy's murder, men of vision remained on leadership's sidelines. Now the presidency has become a caretaker office. Our leaders are snake oil salesmen and carnival barkers, distracting the attention of a desperate electorate, while servants of the oligarchy empty the contents of the public purse as quickly as it fills. From November 22, 1963, the leadership of America has manipulated her people to the point of psychotic perversion. Numbed by the sting of death, Manasseh has simply been going through the motions ever since, unable to concentrate long enough to realize that she has entered into her death spiral. If our people don't snap out of it soon, it will be too late. What has caused this? It has been our lying and greedy leaders, teachers that have denied the power of God to take effect in our lives. We have chosen to listen to soothing lies rather than God's truth, the Holy Bible, because we know that the truth will compel us to change, to see ourselves as we really are. But we are vain. Instead, we'd rather listen to others tell us soothing lies, rather than going to God's word for wisdom and counsel and truth. There is only one truth, and only the God of the Bible can give it to you. No one else can discover it for you. You must find your own place in God's family, and you must do it now, before this nation is destroyed by feckless, vain leadership. Thanks for joining me on my journey of exploration. If you haven't gagged yet, please join me in the next video, where we'll probe even deeper into the sewer under 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.